Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody? And welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 662. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. Well, you may not know this guy on the screen, for those of you that are watching on YouTube. This is the Argentinian president, Javier Milei. And this guy made a big splash a few years ago when he became president in Argentina. And I love this guy. I wish Trump was more like this guy. Many times on this show, I've said that one of the things I didn't like about Trump is I don't understand what he believes in. You know, I mean, I think if you ask people that listen to this show, what does Seth believe in? People would have a pretty good idea. Okay. They kind of know where I've come down on certain things, right? And Trump, you just don't know, right? All you know is that he's believes in making a better deal. And of course, there's no belief system in that at all. It's just, can I get over on top of you? Can I get a better deal than you get out of me? Can I get a better deal out of you than you get out of me? And to me, this is not a way you govern a country. You have to have some principles. It's kind of like running your household. People that have an orderly household that seem to be able to pay their bills, seem to be able to make their life work, it's because they're kind of following a playbook, a set of principles. You know, they don't spend more than they can make. They don't take on too much debt. They don't buy things they can't afford. You know, you kind of follow a playbook and you can make your life work, right? And there's principles involved in that, right? And it just seems like Trump just doesn't have any of that. He just is like an insect. He just responds to stimulus. Something happens, he responds. Something else happens, he responds to that. He doesn't have any kind of, I don't know, the best way I can describe it is belief system. Nothing seems to anchor him in the world. Now, Javier Milei is just the opposite of that. And he goes to the, you can see here that he's at the World Economic Forum. And this is the only speech worth listening to at the World Economic Forum. Everything else is just garbage, elitism. We can do better together, or whatever their message is. Who knows? Javier Milei is the only guy worth speaking to or worth listening to at the World Economic Forum. And I think this is his third year in a row to speak. And you should go listen to all his speeches, at the World Economic Forum. I think the first one he did was very much the economic history of the world and how we got to where we are. And if you go listen to that speech, you'll hear that for like 5,000 years, that not much happened to the average person's lot in life. It was basically bouncing along the bottom. And then, this explosion of growth and technology and everything happened after the Industrial Revolution or during the Industrial Revolution, where the average person's lot in life just took off to the upside. And I think today, one of the things that's driving his speech today, or wasn't today, it was a couple months ago when this forum was going on. But what was driving his speech was all this. People are kind of starting to try to give up on capitalism because capitalism has been so adulterated. It's been so corrupted by the money system and politics and things like that, that it appears that capitalism doesn't work. And so you have all these people clamoring for something new. And the something new always seems to be, some version of socialism, some ism that I just call it collectivism Inc. So collectivism Inc. could be democratic socialism, communism, fascism. These are all These are all forms of collectivism. And, capitalism, the thing that's unique about capitalism, among other things, is there is no collectivism. If you start it and you own the whole thing, then you're the rich guy. And so really, if when you look at something like capitalism, what is the entrepreneur doing? The entrepreneur is the key, right, to capitalism. What is it Jeff Bezos did when he founded Amazon? What did he do there? What he did was he took technology and capital, land, labor, okay, these different forms of capital, and he combined them together to create this new thing called Amazon. Okay. And they deliver packages, as everybody knows, but they also have a streaming service. They have web services where they host entire companies on there and all kinds of things. Amazon's into all kinds of stuff. They've embraced technology in a big way to drive their costs down. Capitalism and business are always the same thing. You're combining land, labor, capital into some new thing, and you're trying to be the lowest cost producer. Because every company needs to make a profit. But if your cost is lower than everybody else's cost, what that means is that you can sell at the same price that everybody else does and make more profit. So it's not like you're trying to, when you're making profit, companies don't have the luxury of just charging whatever they want. That's not how profit works. We spend a lot of time critiquing Dr. Richard Wolff. He thinks profit is something you just give to the capitalist. No. Profit is something the capitalist has to earn. And the way they earn it is by keeping their costs low and selling the value of whatever it is they're trying to sell. So I just love Javier Milei. This is going to be kind of a little bit of a theoretical episode. I mean, he's going to talk theoretically about things, and I'm going to kind of ad lib here and there. But it was so funny. I had to tell you a quick story. I was at the Offshore Technology Conference, and mostly it's just a bunch of vendors and stuff, and they're showing their new technology, they're promoting their brand or whatever they're doing, right? And there's countries there. One of the things you see when you go to the Offshore Technology Conference is there are countries there, and they because countries are trying to court businesses and say, come to Argentina, for example, and develop oil and things like that. And when I walked by Argentina's booth, there was a guy standing in there. I can't remember his name now, but I looked at him and I said, Javier Milei, good or bad? And he was like, oh, Javier Milei is great and all this stuff, And we talked for like 30 minutes. The guy was just, you think I'm passionate about some of these ideas? You should have seen this guy. And he had all kinds of critiques about the Chinese, how the Chinese are doing a lot of things in Argentina, but he said the thing he didn't like about the Chinese people, and he's not the only one there that doesn't like the Chinese people, but he said what they do is let's say they come build some new port, they're going to build a port in their country, in Argentina. And so what they do is they don't do like the engineering over there and then hire, the locals to build it. No, they bring like 30,000 people over and they just do the whole thing. And then when it's done, they just leave. And he was talking about how they don't like that, and he said, that's not how America is. And we've done stuff with America before, and America brings the capital and the investment, and they bring maybe the engineering and some aspects of it. But then we get to use our own people and we learn something in the process. And I was like, yeah, it's ironic that the Chinese do that, because years ago I was calling on a guy who was doing a lot of business in China in the upstream oil business. And he said, they'll spend lots of money with you. You just have to show them what you're doing. So isn't that interesting? To do business over there, you have to show them what you're doing. But when they come do business in your country, they just want to bring everybody and do it. And I thought that was kind of interesting and a little bit ironic. Anyway, Javier Milei is a really good guy. Now, he's a politician, so he's not able to just do all this stuff that he's talking about. But he's making a case that it's not more efficient to have socialism, to have central planning and have ideas come down from the top and be implemented. Even though that's what we see in China, he's saying that that's not more efficient. And he's got a couple of things he wants to say here. So I just want to play it a little bit. And these are fairly short clips, but there's several of them. And, we'll come back each time and visit a little bit about what he's saying.
Thus, by setting aside ethical and moral values, this leads to policies that are not only unjust, but also lead to collapse, not only economically, but also socially, to such an extent that it could end up destroying Western civilization itself. Therefore, in 2024 at this forum, I pointed out that the West was in danger. In turn, in my presentation of 2025, I showed that the agendas and policies that were being promoted from the various international organizations and forums were nothing more and nothing less than a whole set of socialist policies elegantly wrapped to deceive people with noble and beautiful souls, with good intentions, but with the same catastrophic results as always. That is why we must never forget the words of Thomas Sowell about socialism, to which he recognized the merit that it sounds very nice, but whose flip side is that it always ends badly, horribly badly. Without going any further and beyond the continuous disasters caused by socialism during the 20th century, we see the aberrant damage caused in Venezuela, and not only by an 80% drop in its GDP, but much worse still, in light of the establishment of a bloody narco-dictatorship whose terrorist tentacles expanded throughout our American continent. Therefore, today more than ever, in the face of the ethical and moral degradation that the West is going through, as a result of having embraced the new socialist agenda, it is necessary to resolve and push the ideas of freedom.
Okay, so he's talking about morality there, and he's associating morality with freedom. Now, why is he doing that? What's going on there? Why is he talking about this? The way socialism works is it's kind of like Obamacare. Okay, Obamacare. What happened is the government said, this is just emblematic of the way socialism works. The government says there's a problem. Okay, there is a problem with the healthcare system. We're going to come in and fix it. And what they do, because the government has to, if it's going to lower somebody's costs or it's going to do something, it has to get everybody to contribute, right? So it needs money from everybody. And what happens is there's some people, the elites and the connected people, what they end up doing is they end up rigging the game in their favor. So what they do is they have everybody's money, all right, because the government passes a law and says, you will pay this, okay? And you will do it this way, and so on and so forth. And so all these fascist companies like United Healthcare and Aetna and all these companies that were complicit in all this, the reason they became complicit is because the government is going to point a gun at everybody and make everybody pay. And so they're looking at that going, oh, wow, that's a lot of customers. The customers have to pay. See, United Healthcare and Aetna can't make you do anything. That's why I try to explain to people about corporations. Corporations have no power. They have no power of law to make you do anything. They have to convince you to take money out of your pocket and give it to them. What they're doing has to be of value, and it has to be enough value that you're willing to take money out of your own bank account and transfer it to their bank account. Okay? That's not what happened in Obamacare. What happened in Obamacare is they said, we're going to pass a law and force everybody to pay. And then the companies were like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, we want to be a part of that. We'll help make some rules and we'll make sure that some of that money flows to us. Okay? But notice that lacks morality. Okay, there's nothing moral about that. If I come to you and I hold a gun, or let's say I don't even hold a gun. Let's just say I'm big and scary. And I come up to you and I say, give me your wallet. Okay. Not, may I have your wallet, please? I'm hungry. Okay. I'm saying, give me your wallet or I'm going to beat the living shit out of you. Okay. Obviously, we would recognize that as immoral, right? You can't just threaten violence on somebody and threaten to take what's theirs from them, at the point of a gun or otherwise, right? But when the government passes a law, okay, and that law has some function other than protecting liberty and property, then it's not a just law, okay? And the reason it's not a just law is because it's forcing you at the point of a gun to contribute. And maybe you don't want to contribute. Maybe you're like, no, I like my, in fact, this was a big deal, right? If you like your healthcare, you can keep it. Well, it turns out that wasn't true. Well, of course it wasn't true, because what they had to do is they had to rig the system for the connected people, and they had to force everybody to pay. And that's how you do it. But notice there's no freedom in that. Where's the morality in that? Just because Congress passes a law that says that Barack Obama's administration can steal money from me and give it to United Healthcare and Aetna and call it healthcare, that doesn't make it moral. And it doesn't matter that you're trying to help, the 5% of the population that can't afford insurance. Okay. It doesn't matter. It's still immoral. There's nothing magic about, the building that Congress sits in that somehow makes that moral. So this is kind of what Javier Milei is talking about. If you want to have a system that is compatible with liberty and it's compatible with property rights, well, then you can't pass laws and steal people's stuff for the good of the people. I mean, it doesn't work. It's not efficient. It's not freedom. It's not moral. Okay. And it doesn't matter that 51% of the people voted for it. That doesn't matter. I used to tell people, because George Bush was very unpopular back in the mid 2000s. And I mean, people were really ready to just hang the guy, And I used to give the example, if 51% of the population went to the polls tomorrow and voted to drag George Bush out into the street and put a bullet in his head, would that be right? Would that be a legitimate thing to do? And of course, people, anytime you give somebody a real extreme analogy or example, they're just aghast. What? No, I'm not saying that. Well, you are saying that. Okay. When you're voting for the government to take money, my hard-earned money, okay, to force me to pay something that I don't want to pay for. Okay. I'm just, leave me out of it. Okay. When you do that, that's immoral. And it doesn't matter that you voted for it. That's the libertarian lesson that people need to learn, that voting doesn't make something right. If people voted to kill George Bush because of the Iraq War, that wouldn't make it right. That wouldn't make it moral. And this is the thing that people are missing when you wash policies through government. Well, we voted for it. Oh, and some people make this point sometimes, is one of the reasons socialism killed so many people in the 20th century is because there were a whole bunch of people that didn't want to go along. And so the government just killed them. If there's a plan and you don't want to go along with the plan, and the government says, go along with the plan or you're going to catch this bullet. I mean, some people believed enough in it that they caught a bullet. And that's really the problem with socialism or any kind of what I just call collectivism. Fascism, socialism, democratic socialism, communism, these are all collective systems. These are all systems where the individual must submit himself or herself to the collective. The people are important, not the individual. And our founders knew about this, right? Because, just look on our money. It says e pluribus unum, from many one, okay? In other words, the individual is what we're protecting here in America. Yes, we have many people, but the individual reigns supreme. The individual is sovereign unto himself. Okay? Man is an end unto himself. We mentioned the other day. And the morality of it, the freedom of it, the fairness of it, the sheer amount of growth and standard of living that comes out of this system, it's all worth it. But it's constantly being undermined by people like Bernie Sanders that are running around going, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have a single payer system. As if that's the thing we need. If we had no government involvement in healthcare wouldn't cost you $20,000 a year. It's costing some people that much. It just wouldn't. They would implement systems. They would optimize their labor, their capital, their technology. They would optimize all this stuff. They would compete. They would advertise for our business. Doctors would start advertising and saying, your first 5 visits are free, and stuff like that. They'd be competing for our money. But they don't have to compete because the government has set up this system where, you have these networks and the insurance companies have the money is, the insurance companies are kind of like the federal government. The money is being washed through the insurance companies, and then some of it comes back to us in the form of healthcare, but a whole bunch of it doesn't. All right, let's continue with Javier Milei. Got other clips here that we need to play.
However, unlike the way it was approached in the past, which was based on a utilitarian approach, today the defense of the free enterprise capitalist system must be based on its ethical and moral virtue. This is, as Israel Kirzner points out, today's socialists do not deny the superiority of capitalism in production. They question it for being unjust. Therefore, it is not enough for the system to be more productive, because if its root were unjust, capitalism would not deserve to be defended. Therefore, today I will show you that free enterprise capitalism is not only more productive, but it is also the only system that is just. In turn, I will show you that there is no dilemma between political utilitarianism and value-based politics.
Why is it the only system that's just? Because it's based on voluntarism, okay? Which is an individual liberty. Okay, that's why it's just. Nobody, again, Amazon cannot force me to spend money with them. United Healthcare can, through the government regulation and the laws. But Amazon can't. Amazon can't point a gun at me and tell me to buy stuff through their company. They have to earn it. They have to look at, I ordered something from Amazon the other day and it came the same day. I mean, it used to be that you're like, well, I don't really need it for a couple of days. I'll order it from Amazon. Now it comes the same day in some cases. So what does it do? It saves me a trip from getting in my car and buying expensive gas and driving across town and going to the store. So why does Amazon do that? Why don't they just continue to charge us shipping and deliver in 3 or 4 days? And why do they keep getting better? Because it's a free market and they have to compete for our dollars. That's why. That's why it's just. It's just because it allows us the freedom to choose. Do you have a freedom? Do you have freedom to choose your health care in our current Obamacare system? No. If you work for an employer and they provide it, that's your choice. You don't get multiple choices. If you work for yourself, I mean, you get multiple choices, but none of them are very good and they're very expensive. Why are they expensive? Because so much of the healthcare system is run through government. That's why. And it's so inefficient. And Medicare is a big chunk of it. Medicare and Medicaid, actually. So, yeah, look, I keep picking on healthcare, but for something to be just, it has to be in line with liberty. It has to be in line with property rights. Again, the example, if I come up to you on the street and point a gun at, give me your wallet. Well, everybody knows that's not just. Why is it not just? Why is it not a just act? Because I'm forcing you to give me your wallet at the threat of violence. Okay? the government, like paying your taxes is another good example. What happens if you don't pay your taxes? What happens if you just say, you know what? Forget the IRS. I'm not paying. You'll probably end up in jail. So what is that? That's a gun. That's force. So the IRS says pay your taxes or you go to jail. That's just a type of force. That's a threat of violence or a threat of incarceration. That's a threat to take away my liberty, my freedom, my individuality. So justice is rooted in individuality. It's rooted in liberty. It's rooted in property rights. Okay. That's how we know something's just or unjust. Okay. That's the point he's trying to make here. All right, let's continue.
Because if they were in conflict, it implies that the foundations of political utilitarianism must be discarded as unjust. Therefore, this will imply that if we want to escape our dark present, we must once again draw inspiration from Greek philosophy, embrace Roman law, and return to Judeo-Christian values, which will allow us to save the West. A large part of human conflicts arise from a failed interrelationship between natural law and positive law. Thus, natural law is the law that should govern human.
All right. Yeah, so lost my train of thought. Okay. Yeah. So he's talking about natural law and he's talking about just and unjust and he's talking about positive and negative rights. Okay. So let's spend a minute on that for a second about positive and negative rights, because
a large part of human conflicts arise from a failed interrelationship between natural law and positive law. Thus, natural law, a large.
Okay. Yes. So he's talking a lot about just and unjust. He's talking about natural law. He's talking about negative rights and positive rights. So let's drill into that just a little bit before we go into the next clip. So a negative right is a right that you have that doesn't require something from somebody else. Okay. So you have a right to life. Now, what I mean, sometimes this is misconstrued, this right to life. So let me explain. You don't have a right to have the society preserve your life, okay? You have a negative right to life, meaning you have a right not to have your life taken from you, okay? That's a negative right. Or you have the right to free speech. See, for you to speak, okay, and speak freely requires nothing from someone else. So that's a negative right, okay? Positive right would be, something like the rights we get as citizens. Now, personally, I would rather see no positive rights at all, period. But there's some that are good. I mean, I guess, that's in the Bill of Rights. So, for example, you have the right to a jury trial. Well, that does require something from society, okay? So it's kind of a positive right. A positive right meaning, when you get called to jury duty and you have to sit on a panel and listen to some case, that right comes to you because other people are having to give something up. That's a positive right. So negative rights don't require anybody to give up anything, and positive rights require people to give something up on your behalf. Okay, so anything around citizenship could be a positive right. So, for example, if you're a citizen of the United States, currently we have Social Security. That's a positive right. You would say that you have a right to Social Security. Okay. Now, technically, that's not accurate because you have a right to Social Security as long as Social Security is solvent. If Social Security becomes insolvent and there's no money, well, then, no amount of you standing up and asserting your rights are going to make that possible. Same thing if we're the interest on the debt goes to 3 to 4 to 5 million, and all of a sudden there's not enough money to pay for SNAP or welfare, HUD housing subsidies and these other things that some indigent people get from taxpayers. If there's no money for that, then there's just no money. What was it? Margaret Thatcher said famously, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money, right? When you go around and insert all these positive rights and you tell the government that it's okay to steal from people to provide these positive rights, you can dress it up in rights language, but at the end of the day, when you run out of other people's money, it's over. Okay. It's just over. And so the best thing you can do is to create an environment where people can take care of themselves. They can take care of their own needs. They can earn a fair wage. They can use that wage to gather the resources for them and their family. They don't need the government. That's the best kind of situation to foster. But we constantly have people clamoring for more stuff from the government. Why? Because we have unjust laws. This is what Bastiat famously said. He said, look, if you create a law that does something other than protect liberty or property, then that's a perversion of the law. And that another way to say that is that law is unjust. Okay. And when you have unjust laws, everybody's trying to live at the expense of everybody else. Everybody wants what they want. They just want their neighbor to pay for it. Okay. And that's where positive rights lead. That's why positive rights in general are not good. Now we have, like I said, we have a few that are in our Bill of Rights. And we could argue about whether those are good or not. I would say in minarchist language, which a minarchist is just someone who believes in a minimal government. Okay. But we're way beyond that, right? We had a minimal government at one time, 250 years ago. Oddly enough, we're celebrating that. But we don't have a minimal government anymore. So there is no minarchy. Okay. There's oligarchy and massive government corruption and largesse and Leviathan. There's a book by Robert Higgs called Something in Leviathan. I forgot what it was called, but Leviathan is government. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, this idea of just is really rooted in liberty and property rights. That's what you have to remember. And anytime the government says, well, we passed a law. Okay. You can argue then about whether that law is just or unjust based on whether it protects liberty and property or protects some connected class or something, or bails out the banks at your expense or whatever, subsidizes the solar power business or, subsidizes green energy or subsidizes Tesla for that matter, or SpaceX or whatever. Okay. The laws, the appropriations that are being used to do those things are unjust. Okay. They're taken from you, literally at the point of a gun, or at least the threat of going to jail. So years ago, I was talking to my cousin and we were talking about this, and he does really well. I'm not going to mention his name, but he does really well. He lives in New York and everything. And he was telling me that he doesn't mind paying taxes because so many people have so little, and he does pretty well and he doesn't mind paying. And I just asked him, I said, well, so you're okay with all these wars, like the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya? And he said, oh, no, I'm not okay with that. No. I'm like, well, you're paying for that too. And this is just lost on people. So the thing about the government, it's an all or nothing deal. You pay everything and you don't get to choose anything. And, literally nothing else is like that in your life. I get up every day, and just this morning, I drove past, 3 or 4 different gas stations and pulled into one that had a price for gasoline that I liked. And I stopped in there and I bought gasoline. But it's not like the first 3 were standing out there with a machine gun, threatening to shoot me if I didn't pull in there and buy gas from them. Or I go to a grocery store and I buy something, or buy, a bag full of groceries. There's nobody telling me, don't choose that peanut butter, Seth. You have to choose this one. Here's a gun. We just don't live like this in any other part of our life. But our relationship to government is always this way. It's always, they get to decide how much you pay, and you don't get to you don't get to decide really anything about how that money's spent. And we call this democracy or republicanism or whatever the hell we call it. But to me, it's just theft, straight up theft. All right, let's play some more Javier Milei.
A large part of human conflicts arise from a failed interrelationship between natural law and positive law. Thus, natural law is the law that should govern human beings because it conforms to their nature and therefore is just in a universal sense. It is a common law for all men because it is intrinsic to their essence and therefore unchangeable and immutable. On the other hand, positive law is what men draft to follow their own convenience. In this way, when positive law is in line with natural law, there will be justice. Otherwise, it will be legal, but it will not be legitimate. Based on this, two fundamental rights are recognized: the rights to life and to liberty. Man is born alive and born free and has the right to preserve these attributes of nature. Furthermore, he has the right to have his fellow men respect them in order to seek his own happiness, which is the end toward which every man tends. In parallel, we have acquired rights, which are neither natural nor inherent to the human being, but are instead earned through merit or obtained as a gift. In this way, the fundamental right to liberty is derived from the acquired right of private property.
Okay, before we get into that, I want to address this idea of universality. When laws are just, an easy test is to say, are they universally applied? Okay, think about that now. In other words, no matter who commits the crime, does the law treat that person equally? Let's just look back during the first Trump administration. General Flynn was prosecuted for lying to the government. That's a crime, according to the government. Okay? But how many times on this show have I told you that James Clapper's lied? Susan Rice has lied. I I could go on and on. I wasn't really prepared to talk about all the people that have lied to the government, but they have been many. James Comey lied to Congress. Peter Strzok. There's been a lot of people that lied to the government, but notice General Flynn, he got prosecuted for lying to the government, but none of those other people I mentioned got prosecuted. So that's an unjust law. Okay? If it can't be applied universally, then it's unjust. This is why crimes against a person like murder, rape, assault, these are generally applied universally. Why? Because it's been that way for 5,000 years. But when Congress passes a new law or your local municipality passes some ordinance or law, these are not just laws in the sense that they're applied universally. The purpose of them is not to protect liberty and property. These are laws that are used to control people, extort money from them, do all these other things that don't have anything to do with liberty and property. Okay? And so universality is always a good check to tell whether a law is legitimate or not. So he mentioned that, so I wanted to expound on that just a little bit.
And this is manifested in our ability to freely acquire a good with the fruit of our labor. Or we can receive a good that is freely donated or inherited. In turn, the right to property, especially because of its dynamic consequences, is linked to Locke's principle of appropriation, so that now property can not only derive from a donation, gift, inheritance, or exchange, but also includes appropriation through discovery and creation. Finally, these rights are complemented by the non-aggression principle, which states that no human being has the right to commit aggression of any kind against another human being, which not only includes physical aggression, but also all types of coercion, constraint, or imposition under the threat of the use of force. That is why we define liberalism, according to Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch Jr., as the unrestricted respect for the life project of others. based on the non-aggression principle and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose institutions are private property, markets free from state intervention, competition understood as free entry and exit, the division of labor and social cooperation. Naturally, associated with this social order, the question arises as to whether it is just. Therefore, to determine if the system is just, the mandatory reference is Ulpian, whose basic premise constitutes the foundations of Roman law and is undoubtedly one of the pillars of Western civilization. Thus, justice is the constant and persistent will to grant to each person their right. That is, the intention to give to each person what is theirs, what belongs to them. However, Ulpian's sentence did not stop there, but next he added that the principles of law consist of living honestly without causing harm to anyone and giving each person what is theirs.
Okay, what he's saying there is Hoppian. Hans Hermann Hoppe is a famous libertarian philosopher, German guy, and he created a whole body of work called argumentation ethics. And anyway, he's getting into the weeds a little bit there, but the bottom line is property is, the thing about it is like property. People say, well, I've got property. Yeah, but we've kind of got this strange system of property rights. For example, I own my house, but I have to pay property taxes on it. So let's say I didn't pay property taxes for 10 years and then I sold my house. Well, so is it my property to sell? I mean, so what the government kind of does is it puts a lien on your property and things like this. But I don't know, there's got to be, we have a strange system of property rights. We have property rights and we can theoretically discharge property. The whole key to property rights is you need to be able to control it in such a way that you can dispense with it. You get to decide how that property is used. And so a lot of times we're thinking about property like the home we live in or something like that, but your property could be the oil reservoir under your land, or it could be the coal in the ground on your property, or it could be the water. Okay, the water, let's say you have a body of water on your property. In recent years, the EPA's come out and said, that water belongs to the state. It doesn't even belong to you because it's a pond on your property, but it doesn't belong to you. All the water belongs to the feds, which is crazy. You know, there's just, we don't have a strict system of property rights. Now it's better than some countries, but just think of it as like the burden of regulation on your property rights. And so it's inefficient. If I don't get to say what I can and can't do with my own property, and I've got to go clear something with the state or pay a fee, or they get to regulate me in some way, this is inefficient. That's all. And the thing that I always think about when I think about all these inefficiencies, like regulations and taxes and things like this, I think about the people that are running around saying, well, capitalism doesn't work. It just doesn't work, Seth. And as if, what we are living under is capitalism. I mean, we're all the rich people that that you've heard of are somehow connected to government. I mean, look at Elon Musk. Did you know Tesla, I don't know, for the first 10 years of Tesla or something, if you bought a Tesla, you got a $25,000 tax credit? Well, who did that help? Did it help the government? Did it help you? No, it helped Elon Musk. It helped Elon Musk sell cars that initially were very expensive as he built out the production system. What's interesting about that is you look at Jeff Bezos, he built out Amazon for years. He didn't have dividends on his stock for years. I remember because we used to follow the stock very carefully and trade it and stuff. And he would go on these conference calls and just say, sorry, I'm reinvesting in the company. I'm reinvesting in the company. I'm reinvesting in the company. Jeff Bezos, in a sense, did it the right way. He just kept reinvesting in his own company. What Elon Musk did, and this is the beef I have with Elon Musk, is he got the government to invest in his company by giving you tax credits. Well, who paid for the tax credits? People that don't have Teslas. So people that don't have Teslas paid people that do have Teslas $25,000 tax credit. You may say that, well, that's worth it, because we need EVs or, whatever your justification is. But the bottom line is Elon Musk is rich in part because of the taxpayer. Whereas maybe Jeff Bezos is, I would say, rich more because of who he is and what he did and what his leadership team did at Amazon. All right, let's get to the next clip. We got more to play here, so.
Given the emerging institutional framework, which we have also proven to be just, it is now time to prove that it is also efficient. The first proposal in this regard was made by Adam Smith, who, using the invisible hand argument, postulated that each individual pursuing their own interests led to maximum social welfare. Later, the neoclassicists, guided by an idea of the invisible hand based on Pareto optimality, managed to derive the first axiom of welfare economics, that is, every competitive equilibrium is Pareto optimal. However, this implied embracing a mathematical structure that left the doors open to state intervention, under the good intentions of correcting market failures, which from my point of view do not exist. To this end, the proof developed by Hans Hermann Hoppe.
Yeah, let's talk about that just real quick, because I agree with Javier Milei here. Market failures don't exist. There is no such thing as a market failure, okay? Let's just look at 2008 housing crisis, okay? If you dig into that, what you're going to see is all kinds of regulations around housing. Okay. HUD had all kinds of programs going. You got Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac running the mortgage-backed security market. Okay. Back in the day when I was a kid, if your parents bought a house, they went to the bank drew up a mortgage and my parents signed it. And that mortgage went in a filing cabinet in the bank. It stayed with the bank. Okay. Now what happens is almost as fast as they can, they sell it off in the mortgage-backed security market, okay, which is a fancy term for a bond. They basically take the mortgage and they package it with thousands of other mortgages, and they create a bond. And these bonds are bought and sold on the market at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, okay? And this is preferable to banks to owning the mortgage because they can move their liquidity around more efficiently, okay? But at the end of the day, these are government programs, okay? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they call them GSEs, government-sponsored entities. But we saw in 2008, they were bailed out, so they're basically government institutions. And all the regulations that led to all the dislocations in the housing market, those were all created by government, okay? So it wasn't a market failure. And then you got Wall Street creating collateralized debt obligations. Okay. So they would take a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and kind of do like an investment, what do they call it? When you spread your investments, diversification. So what they would do is they would take some crappy mortgages and some decent mortgages and some really good mortgages, and they'd bundle them all together and create a CDO. And then when they would go to the rating agencies and get the CDO, rated as AAA, and they would sell those to like the Teachers Union of California or something. They would sell these huge bonds and stuff, which were basically bonds, to institutional type money. And what was in there, some of those mortgage-backed securities were with people that did no-doc loans, or lied on their applications, or they didn't have the money they said they had, or they were pulling money out of their house. They were pulling more money out of their house than their house was worth, and all kinds of crazy stuff like this that the government allowed, okay? The government regulates all this stuff, and so they allowed it, okay? There was no free market involved. And then the whole thing goes tits up and shits the bed, and they call that a market failure. No, that's not a market failure. That's not a market failure, okay? That had government regulation, government fingerprints all over it. All over it. And so I agree with Javier Milei. There's no such thing as a market failure. Markets are very dynamic and adjust very rapidly to changing situations. And as long as there's no friction provided by government regulation or government agencies and things like that, the market adjusts. It adjusts very rapidly to changing conditions. But all this regulation and all this having to go to the government to ask for permission or having to do it the way the government says you have to do it, this all causes friction in the market and causes people to game the system in a way that they can get rich or whatever. And people are very inventive. They can figure out ways to get money out of a government system without the government really knowing about it. Okay. That's what they do. People are smart. The market is smart. But if you don't have the government involved in the first place, then it's just a willing buyer and a willing seller. And Trustpilot and places where you can leave opinions about certain people. And, the market kind of figures it all out. I mean, how is it that eBay was successful for years, still is, I guess, successful. But, really people don't know each other on eBay. But you can rate people, you can say, oh, they screwed me over, and you can give them a 1-star or whatever. And all of a sudden it changes how successful they are on eBay. These systems work. You don't need government passing quote unquote laws that forbid people to do this or forbid people to do that. It's just not necessary.
Based on property rights in line with Locke's principle of original appropriation, along with the non-aggression principle, is not only satisfactory in proving optimality, but also leaves no room for doubt for intervention. In this way, Hopper points out that any deviation from this set of rules implies by definition a redistribution of property titles and therefore of income from the users and contractors of goods to non-users, producers, and non-contractors. Therefore, any deviation in this sense implies that there will be relatively less original appropriation of resources whose scarcity is known. And thus, there will be less production of new goods, less maintenance of existing goods, and fewer contracts and trade that are mutually beneficial. This naturally implies a lower standard of living in relation to the goods and services that pass from hand to hand.
Okay, I've talked about this before. He's very technical here. But essentially what he's talking about is like, okay, we've talked about this before where we have the tax economy, okay? And then we have the free market. So like you and I are dealing in the free market, okay? We have to get up every day. We have to go earn money. We take some of that money and we voluntarily buy something, okay? And then what's happening over here in the tax economy is the government has a printing press. Let's call it a printing press. It's not actually, it's not like they're printing up money, actual dollars to spend, but it's effectively that. The banking system coupled with the Federal Reserve can create money and credit, okay? Now, what do they do with that money and the credit? Well, they buy stuff in the market, okay? There's scarce resources. They go into the markets and they buy stuff. Well, what are they producing? I mean, they're going in and buying stuff, but most people that are buying stuff in the market are also producing something. So theoretically, you shouldn't be able to buy without producing, okay? So what is the effect of that when the government goes in and buys but doesn't produce? It's kind of like the little red hen, right? When the little red hen says she's going to bake some bread and she wants to see if anybody would help her, and nobody's helping, right? Nobody's helping produce. But notice once the bread is made, now everybody wants some, right? Well, that's like the government. The government is not producing anything, but they want some of the things that are in this scarce market. So what does that do? Well, it makes your stuff more expensive, for one thing. The other thing is it lowers the overall production in the economy, which lowers everybody's standard of living, including the people in the government. I don't know if you can include the people in the government because theoretically they're not earning their standard of living. They're stealing it from the rest of us. So when you look at Joe Biden and he lives in a $20 million house or whatever the hell, I don't even know that much about his life, but whatever. he has a standard of living, but almost by definition, it's stolen because he's never produced anything. You can think of it like this. You can only have a high standard of living if you produce at a high standard, at a high level of production. I mean, even the Bible says, those that don't work shall not eat. Okay. What is that talking about? That's talking about production. Okay. Work is production and eating is consumption, right? But we have a whole class of people, and I've tried to do some research in the past about how many of our fellow citizens are part of this tax economy, and I think it's a big number. It's like in the 50 million plus. Okay, so you got, and I don't know how many able-bodied workers we could have. Let's say in our size country, maybe 200 million people could work. Okay. Well, you got 50 million of them at least that are not only not working, they have a very high standard of living and they don't produce anything. Okay. So this lowers your standard of living. You should be angry with people that work for the government. I mean, you really should. I mean, I guess there's some exceptions like teachers and things like that, but certainly everybody at the federal level and all the contractors and the military industrial complex and all this stuff, these are not producing all these bombs or planes or aircraft carriers. That does not increase your standard of living. Okay. That's harming your standard of living. And this is what he's talking about here.
In addition to the postulate that only the first user, not the last, of a good acquires the property right over it, it ensures us that productive efforts will be as high as possible at all times. In turn, the notion that only the physical integrity of property, not its value, must be protected guarantees that every owner will carry out the greatest productive efforts of value, that is, efforts to promote favorable changes in the value of the property and to prevent or counteract any unfavorable change in its value. Therefore, any deviation from these rules implies a reduction of productive efforts at all times. Note that pivoting on private property and not on excess demand functions derived from optimization exercises allows reaching an optimum without the need for esoteric assumptions that later provide support for state intervention. At the same time, it avoids falling into the empirical ridicule of the second theorem of welfare economics, which postulates the independence between production and distribution, as if the choice between capitalism and communism were neutral in terms of outcome. Therefore, having proven that the institutions of free enterprise capitalism, sustained by natural rights, Locke's principle of original appropriation, and the non-aggression principle, are not only just but also efficient, at least in static terms, it is now time to prove that free enterprise capitalism fulfills all these same properties in dynamic terms.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty technical discussion, okay? But it really just breaks down to common sense. You'll hear all the time on the news or whatever, they'll say consumption is 70% of the economy. The reason they say that is because we only measure final consumption in GDP. That's it. That's the only reason they say that. And 70% of that number comes from consumer consumption. Some of it comes from business consumption and things like that, but 70% of it comes from consumer consumption. Now, but just ask yourself, it's like a chicken or the egg. What came first? Does consumption drive production, or does production drive consumption? I mean, how do you consume if you haven't first produced and earned something to buy the consumption good with? You see what I'm saying? It's easy to see. Peter Schiff has this great book called How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. And there's these two guys on a beach, and they're stranded or whatever. I forgot their names, but essentially it's just them two, right? So all they can do every day is manage to get up and catch one fish a day. Okay. And of course, That's the production. And then they eat the fish, the consumption. Okay. And then he starts talking about how capital accumulation comes from savings. So what happens is one of the guys decides, okay, I'm going to take tomorrow off. I'm going to catch 2 fish today. Okay. And then I'm going to take tomorrow off and I'm going to build a net. Okay. That's savings. So he saved an extra fish and then he invested capital. Okay. He created a capital good, which is the net. Okay. And he was able to sustain himself because he caught an extra fish. So he sustained himself while he was taking the capital good, the net, and creating it. And then the next day, what he did is he caught like 4 or 5 fish. So then he goes to the other guy and he says, look, I got fish. I caught 4 or 5 fish. You don't need to fish anymore. Why don't you do something else? And the other guy says, okay, I'll build canoes. So he starts building canoes. And the guy trades his fish for the canoe and so on and so forth. So this is how an economy works on a very minor scale. Now, look, economists know this, okay? It's not like these guys on TV don't know this. They absolutely know this. But they think that most economists are on some sort of government payroll. So they're always going to be in favor of some government intervention. But they absolutely know what I'm talking about. But there's always this flirting kind of going on with some ism, some collectivism, where the government, the experts in the government somehow know better than the market and we need to defer to them. I mean, just look at COVID. Just think about how COVID exposed the expert class for what it is. And the truth is, it's like that in everything. You just don't see it. It's not as obvious like it is in COVID. But COVID is a great example of how the experts don't actually know. Well, let's put it this way. They don't actually know, or they did know and it was nefarious. Their actions were nefarious, which I don't know the answer to that. But either way, it's anytime you centralize that kind of decision making and you get everybody lined up to do something, it's like Mao, when he collectivized the farms and killed 5 million people. It was such an error. And he basically pointed a gun at everybody and said, we're all going to do it this way. And so everybody did it that way and 5 million people died. I mean, it's very similar what happened in COVID. COVID, everybody's going to take a vaccination. Okay. No, you can't take ivermectin. No, you can't take hydroxychloroquine. If you so-and-so doctor, you give your patients that, we're going to take away your medical license. Okay. This is the way they corralled everybody into one solution. One size fits all. Everybody do this or go to jail. Okay. Or we'll take away your livelihood or whatever. So anyway, these things just don't work. Okay. And these aren't market failures. All right, let's play the next one here.
Moreover, a separate chapter is due to the institution of private property, and that pivoting on it, the Austrian School of Economics, from Mises Hayek, Rothbard, Kirchner, Hoppe to Jesus Huerta de Soto, have demonstrated the impossibility of socialism and therefore debunking the phantasmagorical idea of John Stuart Mill that postulated the independence between production and distribution. An academic deafness that led to socialism and cost the world the lives of 150 million human beings, while those who managed to survive the terror did so in absurd poverty. According to what has been stated, and in line with the second definition of Xenophon's analysis, economic theory has identified 4 sources of economic progress. First, we have the division of labor, which was exemplified by Adam Smith with the pin factory. Basically, it is a mechanism by which productivity gains are generated that manifests as increasing returns, and although its limit is bounded by the size of the market itself is positively affected by it. However, it is also worth clarifying that this virtuous process is not infinite, its limit colliding with the initial resource endowment. Second, capital accumulation, both physical and human, Regarding physical capital, the interaction between savings and investment is crucial, highlighting the fundamental role of the capital market and the financial system in carrying out such intermediation. On the human capital side, the focus should not be limited to the educational level, but should also consider the development of cognitive abilities. From the birth of the human being, their nutrition and health, fundamental elements to be able to access education and the labor market. Third, we have technological progress, which means being able to produce a greater quantity of goods with the same amount of resources, or producing the same using a smaller amount of inputs. Finally, we have the entrepreneurial spirit, or rather the entrepreneurial function, which, according to Professor Huerta de Soto, constitutes the main engine of the economic growth process, since although the three factors mentioned are important, without entrepreneurs there will be no production and the standard of living would be extremely precarious. Where the entrepreneurial function does not focus so much on short-term efficiency, but rather on the growth of the quantity of goods and services, which leads to higher standards of living. What is truly important is to expand the production possibility frontier to the maximum. Thus, dynamic efficiency can be seen as an economy's ability to drive creativity and business coordination.
Yeah, we talked about this when we were talking about China, and there's just if you really ran an unconstrained capitalism where capital market, honest money existed, savings and investment was respected, the economy that we would be living in would be tremendous. It would almost be unrecognizable to what it is right now. The amount of wealth, people want wealth distributed among the masses. That is the best way to do it. That's the best way to do it. Bring honest money in, and then all these functions that he's talking about, land, labor, capital, investment, entrepreneurship, all these things are unleashed in an honest money system in a way that most people can't even fathom right now. We're stuck arguing about whether or not it's a good idea that we're the only country in the world that doesn't have a guaranteed healthcare system. What? Healthcare system shouldn't even be 20% of the economy. It should be a lot less. The only way you could have room for more stuff, a higher standard of living, is if healthcare became less of the economy, not more. If healthcare became more of the economy because the government took it over, that would just be less for us to do with the remaining funds that we get. So these are just backward ideas. And look, it's a little scary that Mondani and people like this are kind of catching fire, and they're excited. And look, every time I meet a young person, I was getting my windshield fixed the other day, and I was talking to the guy who's fixing it. And he was real curious about all this. He's a young guy. And I said, man, look, and I say this to all the young people. My generation is clueless. We have no clue. I'm not talking about me personally. I'm talking about my generation. You're just never going to solve these problems because my generation can't find his ass with both hands. It's so ate up with Donald Trump and the Republicans and the Democrats and the this and the that and arguing about stupid stuff that doesn't even matter. We're never going to solve this problem. So every time I meet a young person, I'm saying, look, your generation is going to have to fix this problem. My generation's gone. Mentally, they're gone. Most of them are doing pretty well. They think they are anyway, for now. They think they're doing well. And so the status quo is just fine for them. They don't see your plight is their problem. And, if you can just forget about my generation, you're going to have to, as soon as they die off, the young people are going to have to fix all this stuff. But we need to be careful because the way they think they might need to fix it is to bring in some sort of ism, bring in some sort of collectivist system to fix it. And that is not the way to fix the system. So, all right, let's jump in. This is the last clip I've got coming up.
Naturally, given the role of entrepreneurship, the institutions under which it develops are of vital importance. In this sense, both Douglas North and Jesus Huerta de Soto see reducing uncertainty as a key function of institutions. Thus, while North presents it as a set of human-devised constraints that structure social interaction in a repetitive way, Huerta de Soto considers that these institutions, conceived by human beings, emerge from a process of social interaction spontaneously without the design of a single person, which reduce the uncertainty of the market process. In this way, as Roy Cordato points out, the appropriate institutional framework is the one that favors entrepreneurial discovery and coordination. So in this framework, economic policy should be oriented towards identifying and removing all artificial obstacles that hinder the entrepreneurial process and voluntary exchanges.
Okay, so this is, again, this is kind of cryptic. Tom Woods likes to say, you know, we don't need a guy standing up there with a bullhorn barking out orders. This activity in the market is spontaneous. These people seek out one another and they partner and become one's vendor, and this order is created. It's spontaneous. It doesn't need a Barack Obama telling people what to do. It doesn't need a Donald Trump telling people what to do. It's spontaneous. It just happens. And I think the reason this is difficult for people is because most people don't have a lot of humility. You know, they're clamoring for the strong man. They want the strong man to come in there and make the Democrats do this and make the people that aren't cooperating do this or that. And now we're in control of the economy. We're driving this economy, you know. But that's not really what happens. In fact, even if you bring a strong man in, that's really not what happens. People just find a way around those orders. And so this entrepreneur, what the entrepreneur is doing is they're looking for gaps in the marketplace. And then they're looking into their knowledge about land, labor, capital, you know, what the market is saying. And then they're filling this gap, okay? And it's risky, right? Because maybe they're hearing voices. Maybe they're not hearing what the market is actually saying. Maybe it's kind of like where the devil's on one shoulder and the angel's on the other. They think they're listening to the angel, but maybe that's really the devil talking to them or something, you know? So entrepreneurship is very risky, right? You can borrow money, assemble factories, you know, land, labor, and capital, put some idea into action, and boom, no sales. Entrepreneurs don't have guns like the government. So if there's no sales, then you quickly go out of business, or you have negative profits. And negative profits are telling you that what you're doing is not being demanded by the market. I mean, if the government wasn't taking our taxes at the point of a gun, the tax revenue would be going down so fast, you could hardly catch it. It would be dropping like a knife, a falling knife. But because they have a gun and they can confiscate it from us, from our employers and things like that, the revenue doesn't fall because people don't want to go to jail. But entrepreneurs can't do that. Okay, so that's why their job is very risky. And this is why it's also a very important function. And we need to respect the entrepreneurial function in the economy. All right, let's continue.
In this sense, given the determining influence of institutions on economic progress, this directs our gaze towards the importance of ethics, since those societies that adhere to more solid moral values and ethical principles in support of institutions will be dynamically more efficient and thereby enjoy greater prosperity. Thus, the fundamental ethical problem comes to be conceived as the search for the best way to foster coordination and entrepreneurial creation. Therefore, in the field of social ethics, the conclusion is reached that the conception of the human being as a creative and coordinating actor implies accepting as axiomatic the principle that every human being has the right to appropriate the results of their entrepreneurial creativity. That is to say, that the private appropriation of the fruits of what entrepreneurs create and discover is a principle of natural law, because if the actor could not appropriate what they create or discover, then their ability to detect profit opportunities would be blocked and would disappear. The incentive it has to carry out its actions.
he brought up this, he connected this idea of dynamics, market dynamics, or dynamism with entrepreneurism. And so just think about that. If you're is efficiency related to dynamism, or is it related to a smart guy at the top that can bark out the right orders? I mean, what's your gut feeling tell you? My gut feeling tells me that the dynamism in an economy has to do with the people, the entrepreneurs, quickly responding to the market needs. And that creates this dynamism, which also creates a lot of efficiency. It's not, I know it seems, this is the way it seems. It seems like it would be very efficient for Donald Trump to just stand up there and say, do this, do that, you do this, you do that. Seth, you go over and take care of this. And John, you go over there and take care of that. I know that seems efficient when you're just looking at it like that. But then when you consider the billions and billions of decisions that are made literally on a daily basis, then how efficient is that really? And this is kind of the way I think it helps to think about it. I understand the tendency to say, well, if we can just get 350 million people moving in this direction, Donald Trump can just bark out an order and that'll be efficient. Yeah, but what if it's not the right order? Then you get Mao's situation. 5 million people die. Okay. This is why central authority is bad. This is why the founding fathers knew it. And that's why they created federalism, which we've destroyed. Everything good. Look, I'm optimistic about America. I think America will find some way to right itself, okay? But my optimism is some point in the future. It's not right now. Everything good about America, government has screwed up. Everything. Capitalism was great. Massive numbers of people were coming out of poverty during the Industrial Revolution. Massive numbers, and even more massive numbers should be coming out of poverty now, but are not because our government is $7 billion or whatever it is. That's it. That's the only reason why. Otherwise, there would be employers everywhere would be looking for people. There would be a huge demand on people. Labor would be bid up. There would be more numbers of things. I read something somewhere, and this is speculation a little bit, but this is like 10 years ago. I read somewhere that if we didn't have the tax system that we had over the last 50 years, that the GDP in America would be something like $60 trillion. What? 60 trillion. Now, so just to kind of, what does that mean for me, Seth? What does that mean? Okay, so the government's got 60 trillion instead of 18 or whatever it is. Well, that just means that you would be 3 times more wealthy. Okay? So whatever you make would buy 3 times as much as it buys right now. That's the way to think about that. $60 trillion. That's an amazing number. And they were just saying the cumulative, I call it the bricks in the backpack. You put a backpack on and you're carrying it, right? Well, the government's it's like they're following you around and they're just dumping bricks into your backpack. Just every time you take a step, there's another brick for you, Seth. Seth, you want another brick? Here's another brick for you. Here's another brick. And they have an endless supply of bricks and they're just constantly putting them in your backpack. That's what the government is. And so if you take out all those bricks, instead of you producing, 17 trillion in GDP, you'd be producing 60 trillion. And that's 60 every year and growing. Okay. So it's not like just 60 one year. Okay. Well, now we're back to 17. No, this is 60 and then 62 and then 66 and then 75 and so on and so forth. You're talking about a tremendous increase in the standard of living. But we just don't have it because we have too many people that think the best results somehow come from government. And they get to vote. And we don't have enough people like, we don't have any people like Javier Milei in the U.S. government, maybe Thomas Massey, but he's leaving in January. I mean, maybe Rand Paul, but these guys are getting run out on rails. All the good guys are getting run out on rails. And all we got is a bunch of idiots now. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene run out on rails. Did you know she ran like a $20 million construction business or something in Georgia? I mean, this is not an idiot. The way she's portrayed in the media is disgusting. But this is not a dumb woman, okay? Granted, she got the business from her father, but she learned under her father, which is how people did it. You know, that's how, look, when you grew up on a farm, see, this is how upside down everything is. Now we think everybody, okay, you got to move into a good neighborhood so you can have your kids go to school with other good kids or whatever. That's fine, I guess, as far as it goes, but your kids are not getting your values while they're at school. They're getting somebody else's kids' values, okay? 100 years ago, 150 years ago, kids grew up on farms with their parents, and they got their parents' values. And now what we've done is we've ceded all that raising of the kids to the state, and we don't even realize it. Now we rationalize it and say, well, I got to get my kid into a good school because I don't want my kid to go to the hood with these other kids that are in the hood. And we rationalize that that's better, and it is better than them going to the hood, but it's not better than them growing up in your own house and getting your value system. Okay. Where do you think all this transgender crap comes from? It comes from the schools. That's where they're teaching it. That's where the kids are getting these ideas. That's where they're getting confused and saying, I don't belong in this body and all this crap. Okay. Just understand that 150 years ago, that's not how we did it. Your kids grew up with you until they were 18 and left the house. And so they may not like you. Okay. They may have hated their dad and didn't like their mom, but they were taught how to be by their mom and dad, not by the teacher standing in front of the classroom and the other idiots in the classroom. Okay. That's like the blind leading the blind, having all those kids. I remember not too long ago, I used to go, man, these kids are like little street lawyers. You know, they go to school and they find out, you know, well, my parents are grounding me because of this. And the kids are telling the other kids, hey, you know what? You need to call CPS on them. That'll show them. It's like, what? What kind of freaking idiot kid would do that to his parents because he doesn't like their discipline? I mean, that's just where we are today. People are going to the state, and you know me, I think that's evil. I don't care if you're a kid or you're another adult. You go to the state and you go, well, Seth's doing this, and you sick the state on me, you're evil. Okay? That's the way I look at it. This whole telling on your neighbor and all this kind of stuff, I don't like. That's a bunch of BS. Or worse yet, using the state to bankrupt somebody because you don't like them, because they were at January 6th. They were at the January 6th protest. I don't like those people. I'm going to bankrupt them. I'm going to use the state to do it. That's evil, man. That's terrible. And so these are kind of the fruits of the system that we've created. And someone like Javier Milei is trying to say, look, this is not the right kind of system. It's not producing prosperity. It's producing totalitarianism. It's producing immorality in our culture. It's producing a lot of negative things. And if we want to fix it, then we need to embrace private property, liberty, free markets, voluntarism, cooperation, voluntary cooperation. We need to quit embracing the guy with the gun. Okay? All right. With that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys for coming in and listening. Appreciate you listening. If you are listening and not watching, if you could go to YouTube and like and subscribe, that would really help me out. YouTube has a really great engine for finding viewers, but you need like a few seed viewers, right? You need to sprinkle some seeds in there so that the other kind of catches on. It's like fishing, right? You got to put a little bait on the hook, and that bait is likes and subscribes. Okay, so go to YouTube, like and subscribe. Who gets to decide? Come back and listen. I'm going to have another show. I'm going to be out of town all next week. Okay, so I won't be here to do a show. But before I leave, I will put out another show. I don't know what it's going to be about yet, but I will put out another show, and look forward to talking to you guys then. All right, everybody. Peace. I'm out. Take care.